Growing up, I always thought life was filled with unexpected twists, bringing both joy and challenges. Over time, I learned to embrace each day, accepting that not everything was within my control. My journey began in a small, close-knit town, where my family instilled in me the importance of perseverance. From a young age, I longed for adventure, a passion that followed me into adulthood. This desire eventually led me to purchase my first motorcycle, a sleek black machine that I rode everywhere. Little did I know, that bike would play a pivotal role in events that would forever alter my life. In college, I met Beth, a lively woman who quickly became the most important person in my life. Our relationship blossomed, and after graduation, we got married, dreaming of a future filled with love and success. We moved into a cozy 3-bedroom apartment, and I started my career as a mechanical engineer. Life seemed perfect as we began planning for a family. But then, everything changed when tragedy struck. My name is Tim Robinson, and this past year has been nothing short of a nightmare. It all began with a motorcycle accident, where a truck merged onto the highway, colliding with me directly. After the crash, I was completely incapacitated, able only to breathe and blink, struggling even to swallow. I had lost all sensation below my neck. The hospital doctors said I was fortunate to survive, and a settlement from the trucking company covered my medical expenses and provided lifelong financial support. After spending 6 months in the hospital, I finally returned home, but things only grew worse. "How's that?" the counselor asked. I felt ashamed to even talk about those 6 months. "That's okay," she said softly. "I'm here to help," I nodded, and took a sip of water. She then inquired about my marriage, and I explained how Beth and I had met in college, getting married shortly after graduation. At the time of the accident, I was 25, and we had been married for 3 years. Beth worked as a paralegal, and we lived in a spacious 3-bedroom apartment, planning to convert one room into a nursery. After the accident, the nursery became my room, outfitted with my medical equipment. Although Beth tried her best to care for me in the first month, it became evident that she couldn't manage, especially with tasks like helping me in the bathroom. Beth sought assistance from our neighbors, Don and Kathy Akin. Don, an attorney at Beth's firm, and Kathy, a nurse, checked on me regularly. They even helped us hire a home health nurse. Despite the support, it became clear that Beth was overwhelmed, and that's when Don stepped in. The counselor asked, "Did Don get involved?" I nodded. At first it seemed harmless, but I knew he had feelings for my wife. Beth often cried, and Don was always there to console her. I could hear them kissing on the couch, and eventually he would take her into our former master bedroom for intimate moments. But that wasn't the end, was it? The counselor pressed. I shook my head. "No," I replied. Afterward, he would come into my room and mock me, boasting about being with my wife. The counselor's expression turned serious. "Where was his wife during this?" she asked. "Was she working?" "Yes," I answered. "Kathy often worked irregular shifts, sometimes through the night." "I see," the counselor said. "Continue." Taking a deep breath, I told her that about a month later, Don came into my room while Beth was in the shower. I couldn't even bring myself to finish explaining what had happened. "Did he take advantage of you?" the counselor asked gently. I nodded, wiping away tears. "Yes," I whispered. "How often?" she asked. "A few times a week, for about 4 months. He even threatened to invite his friends." "Did your wife know?" she asked. I shrugged. "I don't know. She was never there when it happened, but she would later praise Don for helping take care of me. I'll never forget when he set up a monitor in my room so I could watch him with my wife." Beth thought it was thoughtful. "When did the mistreatment stop?" the counselor inquired. "The day Dr. Steiner visited," I replied. I would never forget that day. Beth had brought Dr. Steiner and my lawyer into my room just hours after Don had taken advantage of me. Dr. Steiner, a short, balding man with a German accent, introduced himself. "Tim, I'm Dr. Franklin Steiner, here to discuss a potential treatment for your condition." Turning to Beth, he added, "I'll handle it from here. Please wait in the other room." Beth left, concern etched on her face. Dr. Steiner sat down, looking directly at me. "I run a research facility near Lake Arrowhead. We specialize in 3D bone reconstruction and nerve repair. After reviewing your case, I believe we can help restore much, if not all, of your physical abilities. Are you interested?" Blink once for yes, twice for no. I blinked once, desperate for hope. "Good," he said, smiling. This procedure is experimental but fully approved for human trials, and it won't cost you anything. He went on to explain how they would replace my damaged vertebrae with 3D printed ones made from a material even stronger than the original. Tiny electronic implants would aid in nerve healing. The surgery would take 3 to 4 hours, followed by a few days of recovery. Dr. Steiner reassured me, saying, "If it doesn't work, you'll be no worse off than you are now. But I believe you'll come out stronger than before." After hearing that, I blinked again to show agreement. His assistant then brought over a tablet for me to read through the consent form. After I finished, Dr. Steiner instructed me to blink once if I agreed. I blinked once more. "Very well," he said, and then had me sign electronically using my thumbprint. My lawyer, Alan, countersigned to confirm my consent. "Are you ready to begin?" Dr. Steiner asked. I blinked once, and he smiled. "Let's go. Everything you need is already prepared at the facility." He gestured for his assistant to wheel me out to a large van parked outside. Beth stopped us, demanding, "Where are you taking him? How long will he be gone? How much will this cost?" Dr. Steiner calmly replied, "We're taking him to my facility at Lake Arrowhead. Depending on his recovery, he could be gone for several weeks. His doctor and lawyer are fully aware, and the cost is covered." "We need to leave now," Beth protested. "I haven't seen any agreement, and I don't even know what's happening." Alan quickly stepped in. "He doesn't need your approval, Mrs. Robinson. He's disabled, not incompetent. Everything was explained to him, and he agreed." "Don't you want your husband to recover?" Beth, guilt in her voice, replied, "Of course." "Can I visit him after the procedure?" Dr. Steiner responded calmly. "When he's ready for visitors, yes. For now, it's best you stay here and say your goodbyes." Beth kissed me. "Get better, sweetheart. Let me know when I can visit." I remained silent, the anger boiling inside me. Dr. Steiner and his assistant wheeled me out, loaded me into the van, and we drove off. I saw Beth watching as we left, and for the first time I felt as though I had been rescued. A few hours later, we arrived at the facility, where the nurses began preparing me for surgery. "I hope you don't mind, but we're starting right away, doctor," Steiner said. He turned to a nurse. "Bring him to the operating room when ready." "Yes, Dr. Steiner," she replied. Soon, they had me undressed, washed, and in a gown. I was placed on a gurney and taken to the operating room. 3 large orderlies lifted me onto the table as the anesthesiologist started his work. The last thing I heard was Dr. Steiner exclaiming, "Oh my!" When I woke, I found myself face down, strapped into some kind of device with a tube down my throat and an IV in my arm. The device shifted, and I saw Dr. Steiner standing above me. "You're awake," he said. "The surgery went well. We'll keep you immobilized for a few days to allow proper healing." The tingling and itching in my back were overwhelming, but they also meant the implants were working. "Relax," Dr. Steiner reassured me. "We'll talk more in a few days." He checked my vitals and left. As uncomfortable as the sensations were, it was the first time I had felt anything in over a year. That night, 2 young nurses came to wash me. I could feel their hands on my legs and back, shocking me. They turned the bed and washed my front, and I caught a glimpse of them, a blonde and a brunette. The blonde smiled and joked, "Looks like something's working down here," and giggled. After they finished, they left with some words of encouragement. For the next 4 days, I stayed in the device, following a strict routine of morning X-rays, massages for my arms and legs, and thorough sponge baths. With each passing day, I could feel more. On the 4th day, Dr. Steiner returned, examined me, and quickly jabbed a pin into my leg. I felt it and made a noise, as I still had a tube in my throat. "Did you feel that?" he asked. I blinked once, trying to nod, despite being strapped down. He smiled. "Very good." He then asked me to try moving my toes and fingers. To my astonishment, I could. "Excellent," he said, reviewing my X-rays before calling in the nurses. "It's time to get Mr. Robinson out of this device." They removed the tube from my throat, the catheter, and all the straps, then transferred me back to a gurney and returned me to my room. Dr. Steiner spoke with the nurses before sitting beside me. "I'm very pleased with your progress. We'll start physical therapy now, but it will be light at first to avoid putting too much strain on your back." He handed me a cup with a straw. "Take a sip," he said. I drank, and it felt amazing. "Try to say something," he encouraged. "Wow," I croaked. He laughed softly. "That'll do." "How do you feel?" "Like a new man," I replied, though my voice was weak and my eyes filled with tears. Gently, he wiped them away. "This is a big moment for you," Tim, he said. "Take it easy. Your back still needs time to heal, and you've lost some muscle mass. We'll begin a diet and exercise program to help with your recovery." Dr. Steiner then introduced the staff Angela, the dietitian Ingrid, a muscular blonde who would be my physical therapist Linda, my day nurse and Kiran, my night nurse, a tall redhead with a kind smile. "Nice to meet you," I managed to say. "If you need anything, let us know," Dr. Steiner assured me. "We're available 24/7 once the staff left." Dr. Steiner turned to me with a more serious tone. "Tim, we need to discuss something sensitive. During the procedure, I noticed some rectal damage and took samples. I'm not here to judge, but were you abused?" I nodded, tears spilling over. "Yes," Dr. Steiner's voice grew firm. "I have to report this. It's a crime to abuse a disabled person. The lab is analyzing the DNA. Do you know who did this?" "Yes," I whispered. He hesitated before asking, "Was your wife involved?" "I don't know," I admitted. "She was never there when it happened. Are you willing to name him?" he asked. "Yes," I replied. "Good," he said. "Once we have the results, I'll contact the authorities, and I'll also arrange for you to speak with a counselor." "Thank you," I murmured softly. "You're welcome," he said, offering a reassuring smile. "Now, let's focus on your recovery." They attached a weightlifting device to my bed, but Dr. Steiner didn't want me using it immediately. For the first week, I did hand and leg exercises, while Ingrid kept a strict rhythm, counting in German ein, zwei, drei, vier as I pushed each leg. Her accent was much stronger than Dr. Steiner's, reminding me of a drill instructor. "Good," she said. "We'll get you some protein and build those muscles back soon. Every woman in town will be after you," she added with a laugh. That brings us to now. The counselor put down her pen and looked at me. "Tim, the next few weeks will be challenging, both physically and emotionally. I'm glad you opened up to me, and I encourage you to take action against those who abused you. They broke the law and should face consequences. I'm here for you whenever you need to talk, okay?" "Okay, thank you," I replied. The session ended, and I was wheeled back to my room. A couple of days later, Dr. Steiner arrived with 2 men in dark suits and Alan, my lawyer. After asking the nurses to leave, Dr. Steiner sat beside me. "Tim, these men are here to discuss your situation at home. I called your lawyer too. I hope you don't mind, Dr. Steiner said. "Not at all," I replied. Alan seemed surprised to hear me speak. "You're looking much better," Timmy said, shaking my hand. "Thank you. I'm feeling much better. I can even eat on my own now." "He's doing well," Dr. Steiner added. "If things continue this way, he'll be stronger than before the accident." "That's great to hear," Alan said. He then introduced the 2 men standing nearby. "Tim, this is Agent Smith and Agent Jones from the State Police. They need your statement." "Are you up for it?" "Absolutely," I responded. The agent sat down, and Agent Smith took out a recorder. "Mind if we record this?" Smith asked. "Not at all," I said. For the next hour, I recounted the last 4 months of abuse by Don Akin. It was the 3rd time I had to relive it, and it hurt just as much as before. "So, Mr. Akin attacked you repeatedly?" Agent Smith confirmed. "Yes," I answered. Dr. Steiner interjected. "I have the samples I took, along with the analysis. It's all in my report. We'll need that for evidence," Smith replied. Dr. Steiner nodded. Smith then asked, "Is this the same Don Akin from McMaster and Williams' law firm?" "Yes," I confirmed. "And your wife works there too?" Smith continued. "Yes," I nodded. "Are you claiming they were having an affair during this time?" he asked. "That's right," I confirmed. "Was your wife ever present during the assault?" Smith inquired. "She was in the apartment, but never in the same room, as far as I know. She thought he was helping me," I replied. "I see," Smith said. "Even if she wasn't directly involved, she might still face charges as an accomplice." Alan looked stunned. "Tim, are you sure about this? I know Don, and it's hard to believe he'd do something like this. Maybe you don't know him as well as you think," I responded. "You've seen Dr. Steiner's report and the evidence." Alan hesitated before asking, "I assume you want a divorce?" "Absolutely," I confirmed. He nodded. "I'll get the paperwork started. We'll also apply for a restraining order," added Agent Smith. "Your apartment will be treated as a crime scene. How long will Mr. Robinson be here?" he asked. "At least 5 more weeks," Dr. Steiner answered. "Possibly longer, depending on his recovery." "Understood," Smith replied. "Let's secure search and arrest warrants for Mrs. Robinson and Mr. Akin." Smith, then turned back to me. "If this goes to trial, will you testify against your wife?" "Yes," I answered. At that moment, Agent Jones returned and gave a thumbs up. "The warrant will be ready when we get back," he said. Smith packed up his things. "We'll be in touch, Mr. Robinson. I hope everything works out for you." "Thank you," I replied. After the agents left, Alan approached me. "Tim, these are serious accusations. Don could lose everything: his job, his license, even his marriage." "Are you absolutely certain?" "I'm 100% sure, Alan. I don't care if he loses it all. He deserves it. If you're not on my side, tell me now, and I'll find another lawyer." "I'm on your side, Tim. It's just hard to believe," Alan replied. "Well, he did it. Can I sue him?" "Too, yes," Alan confirmed. "We live in a state where alienation of affection lawsuits are allowed, though they rarely go far." "I'm sorry, Tim, I had no idea." "It's not your fault," I said. "I had no way to tell anyone." We said our goodbyes, and Alan left. I felt some relief knowing that justice was finally being sought. The next 2 weeks passed quickly. Ingrid had me on my feet in no time, starting with short walks on the treadmill and eventually adding weight training. Angela put me on a high-protein, high-fiber diet, and I soon noticed my muscles returning. Meanwhile, the authorities continued building their case against Don and Beth. Alan decided to delay filing the divorce papers until after Beth's arrest. Agents Smith and Jones visited several times with state prosecutors, gathering more details about the assaults. They confirmed that Dr. Steiner's analysis matched Don's DNA. Alan also hired a private investigator to document the affair, which wasn't difficult since Don's wife, Kathy, worked nights and had no idea what was going on. Once all the evidence was collected, Alan reviewed the divorce papers with me. He was filing on the grounds of infidelity, neglect, and cruelty, supported by photos, videos, and audio recordings. Alan also planned to sue Don and his law firm for violating company policy and to report Don to the state bar for ethics violations. I couldn't help but notice that Beth hadn't called or visited me once. It seemed she and Don were too busy with each other, but that would soon be over, and it was. At the end of the 2 weeks, authorities arrested Don and Beth at their office. Alan's process server was there to deliver the divorce papers. The media captured footage of them being led to police cars. The law firm, shocked by the evidence, quickly settled with Alan and fired both Don and Beth. Don was also reported to the state bar. Kathy found out about Don's arrest when he called her from jail, asking her to come to his arraignment to bail him out. Agents Smith and Jones, along with Dr. Steiner, brought me to the courthouse for the hearing. Kathy saw me and rushed over. "How is he?" she asked Dr. Steiner. "Better," I answered. It had been a year since she'd heard my voice. "Didn't you know your husband abused me for months, while also sleeping with Beth?" I told her. "Oh my God," she gasped, turning pale. "I had no idea I filed for divorce from Beth and am suing Don for alienation of affection. If you need a lawyer, I can recommend mine." "Damn right I'm divorcing him," she said, her voice shaking. Inside the courtroom, we watched as Don and Beth, dressed in orange jumpsuits and shackled, were brought in. The state prosecutor requested they be held without bail, citing Don as a flight risk, and asked for a restraining order against Beth. The judge agreed, setting the next hearing for the following week. As they were being led out, Beth caught sight of me, and I raised my hand, flipping her off. After we left the courtroom, Kathy came up to me. "How are you doing, Tim?" she asked. "You look better, thanks. I'm doing much better now, thanks to Dr. Steiner." "I'm so sorry for what my soon-to-be ex-husband did to you," she said. "I appreciate that," I replied. "Did you contact Alan?" "Yes. Don's father insisted on a prenuptial agreement with a strict infidelity clause. Alan's ready to use it." "Glad to hear it," I said. "If you need any help, let me know. I might need copies of those videos," she added. "Of course. Whatever you need." "One last thing," she said. "I still have the key you gave me after the accident. I can clean out your place and get rid of Beth's things if you'd like." "That would be a huge help, Kathy." "Thank you." "No problem. Good luck," she said, giving me a kiss on the cheek before leaving. I marveled at how foolish Don had been to cheat on such a good woman. Done flirting, Dr. Steiner joked. "Let's get back to work." "Sounds good," I replied. "How are we getting back?" "We'll handle it," Agent Smith said. "We brought you here at Dr. Steiner's request." I sat back in the wheelchair as they led me to the car. Honestly, I felt relieved to be using the wheelchair again after moving around so much that day. My body was starting to ache from the effort. When we returned to the facility, Dr. Steiner wheeled me back to my room, where Kirsten was waiting. After dinner, she helped me get ready for bed, then went to the bathroom to change into her sleepwear, which was just an oversized t-shirt. "But how are you feeling?" she asked as she climbed into bed beside me. "Exhausted. It's been a long day," I replied. She kissed me and rested her head on my shoulder. "Yes, it has," she said softly. "I know it's been tough, but it needed to happen. Now, you can start putting it all behind you, and I'll be here to help however I can." I looked at her for a moment before speaking. "I love you, Kirsten," I said without thinking. She smiled sweetly and kissed me on the lips. "And I love you, Tim," she replied, resting her head back on my shoulder and wrapping an arm around my chest. I felt happier than I had in a long time. Soon, we both fell asleep. The next few days flew by, with Ingrid pushing me harder in therapy. I was walking several miles on the treadmill and lifting more weight than I ever had before. The daily X-rays showed that my new vertebrae were functioning better than Dr. Steiner had expected, and the implants had repaired nearly all the damaged nerves. Kirsten spent most of her evenings with me, lying on the bed while we watched TV or simply talked. We often shared a bowl of popcorn during a movie, cuddled up with the bowl resting on our laps. Our nights always ended with a kiss or two, sometimes 3. It made me feel like a high school boy on a date with the prettiest girl in class. I was falling for her hard. By the time Agents Smith and Jones came to pick me up for Beth and Dom's trial, I didn't need the wheelchair anymore. However, Dr. Steiner insisted I use it to avoid any potential injury. He accompanied me, not only as a witness to my condition, but to ensure I made it back safely. I sat in the wheelchair, positioned right behind the prosecutor, with Dr. Steiner beside me. When Beth and Don entered the courtroom with their defense attorney, they glanced in my direction and then whispered to their lawyer. Kathy sat behind them, looking displeased. The jury, selected the day before, took their seats, and the judge entered the room, prompting the bailiff to order everyone to stand. Using the rail in front of me for support, I stood up, noticing the shock on Don and Beth's faces as they saw me. The judge instructed everyone to sit, and we all took our seats. Dr. Steiner quietly asked if I was okay, and I nodded in response. The judge began by listing the many charges against Don and Beth, noting their not guilty pleas. Once both sides gave their opening remarks, the judge turned to the prosecutor, who called me as the first witness. Dr. Steiner walked beside me to ensure I didn't fall as I made my way to the witness stand, then returned to his seat after I sat down. Don and Beth exchanged another stunned look as I began speaking. After being sworn in, the prosecutor stood up and approached me, first congratulating me on my recovery before asking about the accident and the year I spent as a quadriplegic. I understood his purpose. He was helping the jury understand my physical condition before Dr. Steiner's treatment. Most of his questions were about my home life, how Beth tried but struggled to care for me, and how Kathy arranged for home healthcare professionals to look after me. "At any point during this time, did your wife attempt to meet your emotional needs?" the prosecutor asked. "No, sir," I replied. "Did she ever try to be intimate with you?" he continued. "No, she didn't," I answered. "If she had, would it have been possible?" he inquired. I shook my head. I had no sensation from the neck down. "I see," he said. "Did she ever hug you, kiss you, or spend time with you, like reading a book or watching TV together?" I thought carefully before answering. "She'd give me a kiss on the cheek occasionally, but that was about it." "Did she take part in your care, feeding you, helping you bathe, or assisting you in the bathroom?" he asked. "She tried at first, but she couldn't handle it," I responded. "When did Mr. Akin enter the picture?" the prosecutor asked. "Almost from the beginning," I replied. "Were you friends before your accident?" he asked. "Yes, we were," I confirmed. "They lived next door, and we would hang out before the accident." "So it wasn't strange to see him in your apartment," he clarified. "No, we were friends. He and his wife often came over for dinner or a beer," I explained. The prosecutor's next question hit hard. "When did you first realize he and your wife were engaging in sexual activity in your apartment?" "I'm not sure exactly. It could have started while I was still in the hospital, but I can't prove that. He often comforted her when they visited." "I think it was about a month after I came home that I first heard them." "You heard them?" he pressed. "Yes, I could hear them kissing and moaning like they were making out," I said, glancing at Beth as she wiped her eyes. "Then, I heard them in what used to be our bed, having sex." "But what happened after that?" the prosecutor asked. He would come into my room to taunt me while she showered. One day he brought in a monitor and a box, telling me it was so I could watch a real man sleep with my wife, I said, as gasps filled the courtroom. Beth covered her face with trembling hands. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said as the bailiff brought in a cart with a large monitor and a black box. "This is the monitor and box Mr. Robinson mentioned. The box contains a digital video recorder, which was connected to 2 cameras, one in Mr. Robinson's bedroom and one in his room. We have extracted several hours of footage recorded by this device." Turning back to me, the prosecutor asked, "Mr. Robinson, is it your testimony that Mr. Akin used this device so you could watch him with your wife?" "Yes," I quietly confirmed. Beth turned to Don with wide eyes, shock evident on her face. "You piece of trash," she muttered under her breath. "Order in the court," the judge shouted, banging his gavel. Beth fell silent immediately. The prosecutor refocused his attention on me. "Mr. Robinson, were you aware that a camera had also been placed in your room?" I shook my head. "No, I didn't know. And how did your wife react to the monitor?" he asked. Leaning in, I explained, she thought it was great that he got it for me. She assumed it was for watching sports. The prosecutor nodded and asked, "Was this around the time the mistreatment started?" "Yes," I confirmed, my voice calm. "Please describe to the court what usually happened," the prosecutor prompted. Taking a deep breath, I began. "After Don and my wife were done, he would come into my room and turn off the monitor. Then, he would lift me," and I hesitated, feeling the weight of the moment. "He assaulted me," I finished. The prosecutor remained serious. "Is it your testimony that he assaulted you?" he asked for clarification. "Yes," I whispered, barely able to speak the words. "Was your wife ever present during these assaults?" he asked, still focused. "Not that I know of," I replied. He always finished around the time she was done showering. Afterward, she would come in and tell me how grateful she was to have Don around to help. "How often did this occur?" the prosecutor asked, leaning forward. 2 or 3 times a week," I answered. "About 4 months," I responded, my voice steady. A few gasps were heard from the jury. As I glanced at them, I saw several jurors glaring at Beth and Don with visible disgust and anger. Beth lowered her gaze, staring down at the table, while Don sat completely still, staring straight ahead. The prosecutor continued, "So, Mr. Robinson, you estimate this occurred approximately 35 times?" "Yes," I confirmed. "Mr. Robinson, were you aware that Mr. Akin recorded himself during these incidents in your room?" the prosecutor asked, his tone sharp. "No, I wasn't," I admitted, feeling a deeper sense of shame. Turning to the jury, the prosecutor addressed them. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Mr. Akin filmed himself abusing Mr. Robinson 36 times on this device," he said, his voice filled with disdain. He paused for a moment to let the gravity of the statement sink in before adding, "With friends like that, who needs enemies?" The defense attorney quickly stood up. "Objection," he shouted. "Sustained," the judge said, nodding toward the defense attorney. The prosecutor turned back to me. "Mr. Robinson, thank you for your testimony. That's all for now," he said before returning to his seat. "I reserve the right to recall Mr. Robinson to the stand," he added. The judge nodded toward the defense attorney. "Your witness, Mr. Green." Mr. Green remained seated, eyeing me carefully before speaking. "Mr. Robinson, I'm sorry to hear about your injuries, and I wish you a quick recovery. I just have one question. Did you ever express to Mr. Akin that you disapproved of his alleged actions?" His tone carried a hint of condescension. "I couldn't," I responded firmly. "I was completely disabled at the time and couldn't even speak, so." "The answer is no," Mr. Green pressed, leaning slightly forward. "That's because I couldn't," I snapped, frustration rising inside me. "You son of a—" I slammed my fist on the wooden rail in front of me. The room fell silent as I looked down and noticed a crack in the rail. I hadn't realized I'd hit it so hard. The judge stared at me. "I apologize, Your Honor," I said, my anger quickly fading. I lost my temper. "Don't let it happen again," the judge warned. I nodded. "That's all I have for this witness," Green said. Returning to his seat, the judge signaled that I could leave the stand, and Dr. Steiner came over to escort me back to my seat. The prosecutor then called Dr. Steiner as his next witness. Dr. Steiner explained my injuries and the extent of my disability, detailing the damage and how he had gathered evidence. He described the spinal surgery he had performed and how my condition improved after the operation. "In your professional opinion, the only way this type of injury could have occurred is if Mr. Robinson had been assaulted, correct?" the prosecutor asked. Correct, Dr. Steiner confirmed. And this would explain the evidence found, would it not? The prosecutor added. Yes, Dr. Steiner agreed. The prosecutor thanked him and turned to the jury. The sample was tested by the state, and further testing and DNA analysis indicated with 99.999% certainty that the defendant, Mr. Donald Akin, was the source, he explained. But Green looked defeated, as if his final defense had crumbled. He stood for cross-examination. Dr. Steiner, you run the Arrowhead Institute of Advanced Medical Research, correct? Green asked. Yes, that's correct, Dr. Steiner replied. And you conduct some very cutting-edge research there, don't you? Green continued. Yes, Dr. Steiner answered, his German accent slipping through as it sometimes did. Green pulled out a piece of paper and began reading from it. Each of us has various defense mechanisms to cope with extreme circumstances. Sometimes we rely on an alternate version of ourselves, what some might call an alter ego. This alter ego can show up in different ways. For example, a normally quiet person might suddenly become loud, arrogant, or domineering, Green said, glancing up at Dr. Steiner. He continued, for instance, those unfamiliar with this behavior might form a very different opinion of the person. Green then looked back down at the paper. You've also written about something called an inner beast lying dormant within us. According to your research, you claim to have found a way to unleash this beast to handle certain situations. Is that correct? He asked, setting the paper down. I did write that, and yes, my research has shown it to be true, Dr. Steiner responded. Green leaned in slightly. Isn't it true that some time ago you worked with a man named Bill Dalton to help him find his so-called inner beast? A simple yes or no will do. Yes, I did work with Mr. Dalton, Dr. Steiner answered carefully, but the specifics of my work are protected by doctor-patient confidentiality. Isn't it also true that toward the end of Mr. Dalton's treatment, his house mysteriously exploded? Green asked. The prosecutor quickly objected. Irrelevant, Your Honor. Your Honor, Green interjected. We all saw Mr. Robinson's reaction earlier. If allowed, I believe I can establish a connection. I'll allow it for now, Mr. Green, the judge said. But make your point and move on. Understood, Your Honor. Thank you, Green replied before turning back to Dr. Steiner. Are you aware of what happened to Mr. Dalton's house? He asked. I recall hearing about it on the news, Dr. Steiner replied. I also remember the police stating that Mrs. Dalton and her partner were manufacturing pills using highly volatile substances. But I fail to see how this connects to the current case. Green nodded. According to police reports, Mrs. Dalton was seen running from the house screaming about a monster, likely a side effect of the pills she and her partner were making. Dr. Steiner interjected. Your Honor, this has no relevance to the case, and Mr. Green knows that, the prosecutor argued. I request this line of questioning be halted. I agree, the judge said sternly. I've been more than fair, Mr. Green. Move on. Very well, Your Honor, Green conceded. I have no further questions for this witness. The judge dismissed Dr. Steiner, and the trial continued. The prosecutor next called the state agents who had searched my apartment. They both testified to finding evidence of physical abuse. He then called the home healthcare nurses, who had noted similar signs in their records, although the reports had been lost in the bureaucratic shuffle, so no follow-up occurred. Your Honor, I have one final piece of evidence, the prosecutor said. With your permission, I'd like to play a portion of the video documenting the abuse of Mr. Robinson. Proceed, the judge said with a nod. The prosecutor addressed the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, what you're about to witness is disturbing. I take no satisfaction in showing this, but it is essential for you to understand what Mr. Robinson suffered through for months. He switched on the monitor and began playing the video. The jury visibly cringed as the footage revealed Don clearly involved in the acts. The prosecutor paused the video and zoomed in. Let there be no doubt. He told the jury, who is responsible for this appalling act against a man who once thought of him as a friend. As the footage continued, tears streamed down my face in shame. The prosecutor paused the video once more, noting the shock on the jury's faces. I rest my case, he declared with disdain. The judge nodded and turned to the defense attorney. Mr. Green, you may present your case. Green stood up and called Beth to the stand. Mrs. Robinson, he began, is it true that you had an affair with Mr. Akin? Yes, it is, Beth answered quietly. Can you explain why? Green asked, his tone gentle. My husband Tim was badly injured, and I felt lost and hopeless, Beth admitted. Don was there when I needed someone. Yes, we had sex, but it was just physical. Were you aware of what Mr. Akin was doing to your husband? Green pressed on. No, I wasn't, Beth responded firmly. If you had known, would you have tried to stop him? Green asked. Yes, I would have, Beth replied. Thank you, Mrs. Robinson. That's all for now, Green said, turning toward the prosecutor. Your witness, Mr. Johnson. Johnson approached the monitor, selecting an image that showed both my face and Beth's in the same frame. Mrs. Robinson, he began firmly, you testified that you had no idea your husband was being mistreated. Is that correct? Yes, Beth confirmed. Look at his face in this video, Johnson said, pointing to the screen. The pain and humiliation are clear to anyone. Do you expect this court to believe that after 3 years of marriage, you could see your husband in such a state and not sense that something was wrong? Beth hesitated. It didn't occur to me at the time, she whispered. Johnson continued, before Mr. Akin hired home healthcare workers, did you ever feed or clean your husband? I tried, Beth admitted, but I wasn't very good at it. And after that, did you make any further attempts to help? Johnson asked, his tone growing sharper. No, she replied softly. Why not? Johnson pressed, his voice rising slightly. I don't know, Beth said, barely audible. I thought Don was helping him, and I didn't know what else to do. Johnson leaned forward. The truth is, you abandoned him, didn't you? He challenged. Objection, Green interrupted. I withdraw the question, Johnson quickly responded. He then pulled out an audio recorder and addressed the judge. Your Honor, this is a report from Samuel Jenkins, a private investigator hired by Mr. Robinson's attorney. With your permission, I'd like to play a portion of the audio for the jury. The judge nodded. Go ahead, he said. Johnson pressed play, and the courtroom filled with the sound of Don's voice. So, have you thought about what we discussed? Don asked in the recording. I have, Beth's voice replied, and I admit, I'm interested. Well, what do you think? Don pressed. I have to say, these past months with you have been great, much better than my life with Tim ever was, Beth admitted on the tape. Are you sure we can pull this off? She asked. Of course, Don responded confidently. I'm a lawyer, remember. I can get a judge to do whatever I want. Getting Tim declared a ward of the state will be easy. Johnson stopped the audio and looked directly at Beth. So, you and your lover plan to have your husband declared incompetent, take his settlement money, and run off to Costa Rica. Were you telling the truth then? Or are you being truthful now in this courtroom? Tears streamed down Beth's face as she sobbed. I don't know, she cried harder, looking at me. I still love Tim, but I love Don too, she pleaded. Please, Tim, forgive me. I shook my head and turned away, refusing to meet her gaze. Johnson sighed in disgust. I'm done with this witness, he said, walking away from the stand. Green, now back on his feet, called Don to the stand. Mr. Akin, Green began, we've all seen the video. I have just one question. Did Mr. Robinson ever indicate that he did not consent to your actions? Not once, Don replied, a sneer forming on his lips. Thank you, Green said, turning to Johnson. Your witness, Mr. Johnson. Johnson stood and approached Don. Mr. Akin, you graduated from Harvard Law, didn't you? Yes, Don responded, pride evident in his voice. And near the top of your class, correct? Johnson continued. I did, Don confirmed confidently. You're highly regarded at your law firm, aren't you? Johnson asked. Objection, Green interjected. Relevance, Your Honor. Johnson quickly responded, I intend to prove that Mr. Akin was fully aware that Mr. Robinson could not give consent. Proceed, the judge allowed. Johnson turned back to Don. You knew Mr. Robinson was disabled, didn't you? He pressed. Don sighed but remained silent. Didn't you? Johnson demanded. Yes, I knew, Don admitted grudgingly. And you were also aware that state law prohibits people with Mr. Robinson's disabilities from giving consent, isn't that right? Johnson continued, his tone sharp. Yes, I suppose so, Don muttered. Johnson glared at Don for a moment before stepping away. I'm finished with this witness, he said, returning to his seat. The judge turned to Green. Any more witnesses, Mr. Green? No, Your Honor. I rest my case, Green replied. Very well. We'll take a 15-minute recess before closing arguments, the judge declared, banging his gavel. Dr. Steiner handed me a cup of water. Are you okay? He asked. I'll be fine, I replied. Johnson approached me. I'm sorry you had to relive this, but we're almost done. Tim, thanks, I said. As the break ended, everyone returned to the courtroom. Don, Beth, and Green looked far less confident. While Kathy appeared furious, this was the first time she'd heard most of the evidence. The judge re-entered the courtroom. "Mr. Green, your closing statement," he instructed. Green stood and addressed the jury. "This situation is difficult for everyone involved. We all wish Mr. Robinson a full recovery. We have admitted that the events occurred, but this case is about consent. Mr. Robinson never expressed that he did not consent, and Mrs. Robinson had no knowledge of what was happening. Therefore, you must find my clients not guilty." He sat down, and the judge signaled to Johnson. Johnson walked toward the jury, turning on the monitor to display an image of Don abusing me. "Thank you for your service," he began. "The defense argues that Mr. Robinson never said he didn't consent, but there's a glaring problem: he was disabled. He couldn't speak or defend himself. State law clearly states that someone in Mr. Robinson's condition cannot give or deny consent," Johnson said, his voice rising. Mr. Green and Mr. Akin knew this. Akin is a Harvard-trained lawyer. They've admitted to these acts, and you've seen the evidence, Johnson continued. They plotted to have Mr. Robinson declared incompetent, take his settlement money, and run off, leaving him with nothing. Johnson paused briefly before concluding. Mr. Akin abused him 36 times, while Mrs. Robinson did nothing. In this state, abuse and neglect of a disabled person is classified as a hate crime. I ask for the maximum penalty. It's time for justice." Johnson sat down, and the judge gave the jury their instructions before sending them to deliberate. He then declared a recess. In the hallway, Alan approached me. "Beth signed the divorce papers. She's not contesting. In 6 months you'll be free." "Huh," I replied, my voice heavy with sarcasm. "After everything you've experienced, it's no wonder you're feeling stuck," Dr. Steiner mentioned, adding that things will improve in time. "I hope so," I replied, and he smiled, saying, "I think I know someone who can help with that." "You mean Kirsten?" I asked. His grin widened. "Yes, she's quite fond of you," I admitted. "I like her too." "That's great," he said. "Just take it easy, no physical strain for the next 6 to 8 weeks. Your back needs time to heal." He chuckled before warning me. I added, "By the way, how did I even crack that rail?" He laughed. "Maybe it's those supplements combined with Ing's therapy," I joked. "Not related to that inner beast thing, right?" He shook his head, amused. "No, that's something entirely different. Not something I'd recommend for someone with custom vertebrae." We continued chatting until Johnson walked in. "The jury's back already?" I asked, surprised. He nodded. "Yes, that was quick. Good news for us, I hope." Everyone returned to the courtroom, and we all stood as the judge entered. Once seated, the judge asked, "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreman confirmed, and the bailiff handed the judge the verdict. After reviewing it, the judge called for Beth and Don to stand. "On the charges against Don Akins, how do you find?" the judge asked. "Guilty on all counts," the foreman declared. "And for the charges against Beth Robinson?" The foreman continued, "Not guilty on accessory to misuse, but guilty on all other charges." The judge's face hardened as he said, "I've seen many cases, but this one stands out as particularly disgraceful. Not only have you tarnished your marriages, but you've also discredited the legal profession." Turning to Don, he added, "As an attorney, your actions are despicable. I sentence you to 450 years of hard labor minus 12 years for each misuse charge, plus 20 years for the hate crime, and 8 more for conspiracy." Addressing Beth, he said, "Though I disagree with the jury's not guilty verdict, I must abide by it. You will serve 15 years for criminal negligence and conspiracy, with the possibility of parole after 10. Green then stood to request, "Your Honor, Mrs. Robinson would like to speak with Mr. Robinson before she is taken into custody." The judge looked my way, asking, "Are you okay with that?" I nodded. "A few minutes is fine." With that, the judge dismissed the court. As Don was led away, Beth came over. "You're looking well, Tim," she said softly. "Thanks," I replied shortly. Her tone pleading, she said, "I had no idea what he was doing to you. I would have stopped it if I had." Coldly, I replied, "I find that hard to believe. You've got 15 years to reflect on it. I've signed the divorce papers, and I won't fight them." She informed me. "I know," I replied, uninterested. "Don't you want to know why it all happened?" she asked, her voice shaking. "No, it doesn't matter. It was about greed and lust," I said firmly. Her eyes filled with tears as she asked, "Could you ever forgive me?" "No," I said harshly. "I plan to forget you even existed. Is there anything else?" I asked. She hesitated before saying, "I do love you," her voice breaking. I don't believe you, I said coldly. You should go, the deputies are waiting. She said a quiet goodbye and walked away as I watched, feeling nothing. Kathy approached me next, her expression gentle. How are you, Tim? You look much better, thanks, I said. Dr. Steiner has been a great help. Kathy's tone was full of sympathy as she said, I'm sorry for what my soon-to-be ex-husband did to you. I appreciate that. Did you talk to Alan? I asked. She nodded yes. Don's father demanded a prenup with a strict infidelity clause. Alan's been firm about it, she said with a faint smile. That's good. Let me know if you need anything, I offered. I might need those videos, she said. No problem, I assured her. I can also clean up your place and remove Beth's things if you'd like, she offered kindly. That would be a big help. Thank you, I said sincerely. Good luck, I'll see you soon, she said, kissing my cheek before leaving. Dr. Steiner teased, done with the flirting as he approached. Let's get back to work, I said, grinning. How are we getting back? I asked, as Agent Smith stepped in. We'll take care of that. We brought you here at Dr. Steiner's request. I sat down in the wheelchair Agent Smith had prepared, and he wheeled me out to the car. I felt a sense of relief to be off my feet after being on them most of the day. Once we returned to the facility, Dr. Steiner helped me to my room, where Kirsten was waiting. She assisted me in getting ready for bed, then went to the bathroom to change into her sleepwear, which was just a long t-shirt. How are you feeling? She asked as she climbed into bed beside me. Exhausted, it's been a long day, I replied. She kissed me softly, laying her head on my shoulder. Yes, it has, she agreed, but now it's over, and you can start putting it behind you. I'll be here to help however I can. I looked into her eyes for a moment, and then said, I love you, Kirsten, before I realized the words had escaped. She smiled sweetly and kissed me on the lips. I love you too, Tim, she whispered, resting her head back on my shoulder and wrapping her arm around me. I felt a happiness I hadn't known in a long time, and soon we were both asleep. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Ing really pushed me hard during physical therapy, making me work harder and faster each day. In addition to that, I had to attend counseling twice a week to address the trauma I had endured over the past year. Daily X-rays were taken to track the healing of my spine. Kirsten stayed with me every night, and our bond grew stronger. After 5 weeks, Dr. Steiner finally told me I was healed enough to go home. By then, I was in better physical shape than ever, but Dr. Steiner still cautioned against any intimacy for another 3 weeks. He also scheduled bi-monthly checkups for the next year to ensure my recovery. Despite the limitations, I felt excited and relieved to be going home, though I knew I'd miss having Kirsten by my side constantly. On the day of my discharge, I wrote Kirsten a note expressing my feelings and inviting her to visit any time. As I finished up, Dr. Steiner came in with a wheelchair. Why a wheelchair? I can walk now, I said, confused. He shrugged, it's protocol, sighing. I sat in the chair, hoping it would be the last time I'd need to use one. He wheeled me out to the pickup area where I waited to go home. As I glanced across the parking lot, I expected to see the familiar Arrowhead van. Instead, a dark blue Toyota RAV4 rolled up, and when the driver's door swung open, my heart skipped a beat. It was Kirsten, my red-haired angel. She walked around to the passenger side and opened the door for me. Surprised, I glanced at Dr. Steiner, who explained, Kirsten has a new assignment. She'll be your live-in caretaker, unless you have any objections. None at all, I replied, smiling broadly. I shook Dr. Steiner's hand, expressing my gratitude. Thank you for everything, Doctor. You're welcome, he said warmly. I'll see you in a few weeks. He then turned to Kirsten and added, take good care of our guy. Okay, she smiled and replied, I will. After helping me into the car, she got in and started the engine. I noticed several bags packed in the back seat. How long will you be assigned to me? I asked, trying to understand the situation. That depends on how long you need me, she replied. And how long might that be? I pressed further. She smiled mischievously. A conservative guess. At least 60 years. Is that okay with you? Definitely, I laughed. She leaned over, kissed me, and then pulled out of the parking lot, heading home. Once we arrived, I marked a date on the calendar 3 weeks from then, when Dr. Steiner said I could resume all physical activities. Coincidentally, it was the day after my divorce from Beth would be finalized. And when that day arrived, Kirsten and I made love. It wasn't just a physical act, it was an emotional connection that filled a void I hadn't even realized existed. For the first time in years, I felt whole again. Alan's prediction about Don's alienation of affection lawsuit didn't pan out, but that didn't matter because Kathy had completely ruined Don in their divorce. She kept the apartment they had shared, and over time, she and Kirsten became close friends. About 2 years after her divorce, Kathy fell in love with a doctor and remarried. I never visited Beth in prison, though I heard she was undergoing counseling. After serving 15 years, she was released on parole and took a job as a waitress at a small diner on the highway. It was a quiet, unremarkable life, fitting for someone trying to piece together a broken existence. 6 months after my divorce was finalized, Kirsten and I got married. It was a small ceremony with just family and a few close friends. That turned out to be a blessing, as only weeks after returning from our honeymoon in Hawaii, Kirsten gave me the news we were going to have a baby. Our family grew quickly. After our first child, we had 2 more, and we decided that was enough for us. The love between Kirsten and me never diminished. Our lives were filled with joy, laughter, and the occasional challenges that come with raising a family. When our youngest left for college, we celebrated by going on a long-awaited cruise around the world. Even after all these years, Kirsten is still my beautiful, red-haired angel. My health improved steadily, the implants working as intended, and eventually all the nerve damage from the accident healed. Over the next decade, Dr. Steiner successfully performed the same procedure on several other patients, and now it's awaiting final approval for widespread use. Looking back on everything I've been through, I can't help but think of that famous quote by John Milton, "Every cloud has a silver lining." Yes, I went through hell after that truck hit me, but that was my dark cloud. The life I have now, however, is far brighter than any silver lining I could have imagined.